All right. Hi, everybody. This talk is PC43, What's New with User32 and comctl and Win32. Apparently, they changed the order. It used to be comctl and User32. Now it's User32 and comctl32. Hope nobody's confused. My name is Raymond Chen. I work in the Windows experience part of Windows 7. We deal with all the UI and that sort of thing. I also have a website, blogs.mscn.com/oldnewthing. Gets updated every morning at 7, if I remember, and if my computer hasn't crashed. If you're familiar with my website, it sort of talks about the history of Windows, how things used to be done, why things are so messed up, why things are the way they are today. It's sort of a backwards-looking type of website. Whereas the PDC is all about the future and what's coming and what's so great about the future, and it's all rainbows and leprechauns. And so there's this bit of tension between what I normally talk about, which is the past, and what the PDC normally talks about, which is the future. So I settled on a compromise, so we'll just talk about the present. So the talk is going to be about what's new, quote new, in User32 and comctl, if you've been living under a rock for the past 8 years. So these are features that have been added to User32 and comctl in the Windows XP, Windows Vista timeframe. I went and took a look at what's coming in Windows 7, and the answer is, wow, there's some cool new stuff coming in Windows 7 that's covered by other talks. So after taking out all the stuff that was already overlapping with other people's stuff, all that I was left with was the stuff that you can do today, which is great because now you can go home and actually pound out code and ship it, as opposed to go home, pound out code, and then wait for the next beta. So here's a sort of outline of what we have for today. 8 things you didn't know you had. These are features that already are shipping. You can use them. I'm just going to walk you through them, maybe go through some of the pitfalls, clarify some documentation, provide documentation, correct mistakes in documentation, remind you that these features exist. A lot of these features I'm really not seeing used much out in the wild, and it might be because of the bad documentation, poor documentation, and so on. I hope there are 8 of them. I counted them many times, but I will let you check my counting. There are only 7 bullets because there's the word "and" on bullet number 6. So if you count, there's 7 bullets plus an "and," that makes 8. And at the end, I'm going to do a little bit of philosophizing on how foreground activation is like love. So we'll save the philosophy for the end. So one of the things so first we'll going to talk a little about a library called UXtheme. This is the library that first arose in Windows XP. It was used to provide the visual styles. And in Windows Vista, it picked up a couple of new functions that allow you to simplify some of your visual programming. Everybody knows about double buffering. Double buffering is when you want to draw it to the screen. Instead of drawing directly to the screen, you allocate a buffer that's the same size as what you want to render to. You render into the buffer. And then when you're done, you blit the contents of the buffer to the screen. This way, the user doesn't see all of the behind-the-scenes painting, repainting, fiddling around that you do, and it just goes up onto the screen without any flickering. So this isn't exactly rocket science, but at least now it's rocket science that Windows provides, or non-rocket science that Windows provides. What's the opposite of rocket science? I don't know. I do remember that I do have a friend who's a rocket scientist, and I asked him, what do rocket scientists say when things are not really that hard? And he said, most rocket science is not rocket science. So anyway, story for something else. So let's look at the bottom half of the screen first. Your normal WM Paint cycle, you call begin paint. You render your content into the begin paint, gives you a DC. You render into the DC. You call end paint. Boom, you're all done. In order to do double buffering, of course, you insert some code so that way the rendering goes into another DC. And with the double buffering helper functions, this is done with the function begin buffered paint. You call begin buffered paint. You give it some parameters. We'll look at those later. Out comes a DC and a handle to this double buffer. You then paint into that new DC. And then when you call end buffered paint, that tells the double buffering engine to take this temporary buffer that it created for you and to put that onto the screen. The double buffering, one of the advantages of the double buffering helper functions is that they maintain a cache of bitmaps, of off-screen bitmaps that can be used for rendering. This saves the trouble of having to go down to GDI, allocate a buffer, which in principle can be relatively large or not. And so it saves the trouble of going down and creating and destroying these bitmaps all the time. there's no harm in not initializing and uninitializing the buffered paint function, in the sense that there's no harm in that, like, nobody dies, nothing explodes. But it does mean that you don't get to take advantage of the cache, because when you call, if in the absence of the init and uninit functions, when you call nBuffered paint, for all the double buffering code knows, that's the last time you're ever going to call it. So it has to free everything that it had been caching up till then. The initialization of the double buffering helper library is maintained on a per thread basis, and it is reference counted. So the easiest way to just make sure that your window that uses double buffering will have access to the double buffer cache is to stick a call to buffered paint init in your WM create and a call to buffered paint uninit in your WM destroy. Since it's all reference counted, as long as there is a window on the thread that cares, the engine will keep the cache alive on the thread. So let's take a program here. I've got a nice little program here. This is a program that does not use double buffering. It just draws zeros in a little grid. And as I draw, you see that it flickers quite a bit as I resize it and get it to repaint. I threw in some sleep calls here just to make it really obvious when, you can see the progress of the painting, right? It goes, and you can see that it's sort of, drooping down. So let's take a look at the changes we can make to this program. WinDiff, everybody's not favorite but familiar diffing program. We'll drop in a call. We'll include the UX theme library because that's what we're using. We changed the paint function just like I described in the previous slide. We call begin paint, and then we call begin buffered paint, giving it the DC, ps.hdc. This is the DC for the screen. And we tell it the rectangle that we want to paint into. We tell it that we would like a bitmap that was created that is compatible with the final rendering target, the screen DC, and out comes the new DC. We render into that DC, and then we say we're done, and it takes the temporary bitmap and throws it up onto the screen. We also drop in some calls to init and uninit and create and destroy, like I suggested. And then we run this program, and you see that it looks awful. In fact, if I do this, it looks even more awful. Look at that. That's just awful. What's happening? Well, since the double buffering manager is maintaining all the bitmaps in a cache, you see that, for example, here when I resize it smaller, you see a whole bunch of zeros floating around. And that's because, well, when you call it the second time, it hands you back the bitmap that it gave you the first time, and you still have the zeros left over from it from the first time. So we need to remember to, when painting content, normally you don't worry about filling the background because you let your erase background deal with it. But since now we're rendering everything into an off-screen bitmap, that all has to be ready to go up onto the screen. So before we start painting our zeros, we call fill rect, make sure everything is nice and clean. And when we do that, we get a nice and clean bitmap that looks the way it should, and it still flickers. So it's not working. What did we do wrong this time? We're wasting extra time on the erase background. That's right. So, and the fix for that, of course, is to say, well, no, don't erase the background. You can set it to a null brush. You can handle WM erase background and return 1. Either way works. When you do this, finally, we get happy, smooth, non-flickering, scrolling things. Although it's still slow because I threw sleeps in, but there's no flickering. This is already not all that exciting, but you already know how to do this. There's a library for it now. It deals with some various details like clipping when, if the final render target is clipped, it knows to propagate the clipping when bleeding back to the screen. This reduces the amount of bits that have to get transferred to the graphics or over the network or whatever. So there are some small optimizations going on in there that you don't have to worry about. But if you use the library, then they'll be taken care of for you. But really, this is really just a setup for the next part. Well, here's summarizing some of the traps that you run into when you're playing with double buffering. You forget to fill your background. You get the black background. You don't suppress WM erase background. Then you get the flicker on your background when the background draws during erase background. And of course, you have to worry about remote desktop or terminal services. You don't want to do this on very large bitmaps because then you're throwing very large bitmaps over a potentially slow network connection. There's some other fancy stuff you can do with the double buffering. In this sample, I used a compatible bitmap. Another flag you can pass when asking for the double buffering off-screen bitmap is you can say that you want a 32 bit per pixel dib section. This is very handy because now you can just pretend that your program is always running at 32-bit per pixel display because you're rendering into this off-screen bitmap that's in the 32-bit per pixel format. This format is also important if you're rendering to glass because you have to preserve the alpha channel when rendering to glass, so that way all the cool glassy things happen. There's another structure that you can optionally pass. It has flags that talk about if you want to customize a clipping behavior, you can pass an exclude rectangle. And if you're really crazy, you can pass in a blend function, the sort of blend function that you normally pass to functions like alpha, what's it called? Alpha blend. Since it's a dib section, you can get access directly to the bits. There's a helper function, get buffered paint bits. And if you're playing with alpha, you can call buffered paint set alpha. You can give it a rectangle, and it sets the alpha for this entire rectangle. So these are, of course, things you could have written yourself, but they're just little helpers to help you get things off the ground a little faster. But like I said, all this double buffering is really just a setup for the crossfade library. You've seen crossfading before. Let's see if I can do it here. I don't know if you can see it. I'll run magnify. Ooh, magnify. Now everything looks awful. All right. So you see as I hover over the cancel button, it fades into blue. It fades out. That's the sort of crossfade transitioning that I was referring to. My slide deck got reset. Let's try this again. Oops, hey. Whoa. There we go. Let's try that again. So the crossfade animation helper functions they're sort of the same idea as the double buffering. You set up, there's a little extra step where you set your animation duration, specify how long you would like this crossfade animation to take. You call it begin buffered animation, tell it a little bit about what sort of format you would like to render into. Outcome 2 device context, you draw the starting image into the first device context and the ending image into the second device context. And then you call end buffered animation, and then boom, animation starts happening into your window. The animation engine does this by firing WM paints into your window. And so if you're doing this inside your WM paint handler, you need to throw in a call to check if this is a WM paint request that was generated by animation. You call buffered paint render animation. This says, if there's an animation going on, draw the next frame. It returns true if it did. If it returns true, you say, great, I'm done. Somebody else did the painting. Otherwise, you continue with your normal rendering. Although if you look at the way I wrote it, what happens now is that on every paint message, we start a new animation. This is usually not the way you want your code to operate. So what you really want to do when painting with crossfades is to, first of all, identify and isolate your states. For example, a button control will have a hover state, a disabled state, various other state, focused, and so on. You want to take all the parameters that describe the different ways your control paints and isolate them, so that way you can render both in the old state and in the new state. So you want a drawing function that takes a state as a parameter so that you can render both the old and the new states separately. You internally maintain which is the state you most recently drew, so that way when you're asked to provide the before and after, you can provide the old image as well as the new one. And when your window is destroyed, you have to remember to stop all the animations so that way the animation engine is not busy trying to animate a window that's no longer there. Now, I mentioned before that as the code was originally written, it constantly kicks off a new animation every time it receives a WM paint. This is obviously not the way most controls operate. So here we have the code from last time. And I just throw in this little bit here. If the current state is equal to the drawn state, this means that there has been no change in the visual state of the control. Then we just set the duration to 0. The animation engine understands that a duration of 0 means that there is no animation going on. But it still hands you back 2 DCs. However, the starting DC is null because it really doesn't care where you're starting from. You just render into the current state. This lets you use the same rendering code regardless of whether animation is going on or not. After the animation is complete, we save the current state into the drawn state because at this point we have successfully drawn it. So that way, when the state changes, we know what state we most recently drew, so we can provide both the starting and ending images at the next animation cycle. So let's come over here. And so this is the same program we had before, but I isolated the drawing so that way now instead of just drawing a 0, it draws a character. And I, of course, provide some simple equality tests. And in the main program, I also keep track of the state that I most recently drew and the state that the control is currently in. The paint content method is now paint state, and it takes a state parameter. And there's just a little bit of tweaking in here because I want to actually draw the character that is in the current state rather than just always drawing a 0. The paint method is pretty much as I showed in the previous slide. We check with the animation engine to see if there's a frame that is already in the middle of an animation, in which case it returns true and we're done. Otherwise, we build up a little animation parameter structure describing what type of animation we like, and we would like just a simple linear transition from the start to the end. We tell it how long we would like this animation to take, and if there is no change in state, then we just say it's 0. We begin the animation, outcome 2 DCs, possibly a null starting DC. So if we have a DC to render our old state into, we render the old state into that. If it gives us a DC to render the new state into, we render the new state into that one. We then end the animation starts happening, everybody's happy. Oh, and of course, we update the most recently drawn state to the current state so that we know what state the next animation should start from. On the destroy, in case the window is destroyed while an animation is going on, we stop all the animations. And I hooked up a little thing, so if I hit the space bar, it just increments the characters so we can see animations happening. Notice that all we have to do to trigger a repaint is invalidate rec, just like we do in normal code. The logic for the rest of the program doesn't really change. It's just the painting code that has to change. Well, you also have to remember to, since you moved your state into a member variable, that you have to tweak your references to the state to use the member variable rather than just reaching directly into your class. So I think that's all the changes that I needed for this. So if I press the space bar, we see that the 0 gradually transitions to a 1. I press it again, and it gradually transitions into a 2. If I press it twice, notice that it starts changing to a 2, and then I interrupt it, and it continues on to a 4. The animation engine understands that if you trigger a new animation while an animation is in progress, it just gives up on the first one, but continues the animation from where it was at the time you triggered the new animation. So for example, we go from 1 to 2. It goes 1 to 2. Halfway through, we move it to 3. It just stops here and continues up that way. So for example, if I just hit it a lot, we see that there's a whole bunch of little animations going on. It's transitioning sort of on the fly, constantly changing direction, but it looks very smooth and makes you pretend that you're watching The Matrix if you do it long enough. So oops, I'm sorry. I said there was no Windows 7 content. I'm going to do a little bit of Windows 7 content, but it's not a lot, so don't get your hopes up. Windows 7 has a new animation engine. It was mentioned apparently even more briefly than I'm about to in the talk that just finished, given by Leo and Cam, new text and graphics APIs. I'm told that there's a hands-on lab about the new animation engine. The new animation engine is about managing values. So for example, you can say, I would like to animate this variable that represents my x-coordinate from from 1 to 100. I'd like it to take about 5 seconds to do it, and I'd like it to do it following this trajectory. And when you then subsequently ask it, hey, what's the value of the variable, it will interpolate based on time and give you a value that you can use when you're rendering. So this sort of does a lot of the work of doing it. It just does math for you, but it fits into your existing rendering model, because instead of just reading a variable for a member variable, you can just say, query the current value of one of these animated variables. But otherwise, your rendering pretty much stays the same. So it sort of lets you add animation to your program without having to totally tear it apart. End of Windows 7 content. List view tiles, I'm sure you've all seen. This is where list view, instead of placing the label for an item below, puts the label next to the item. And in addition to it, provides some bonus information in additional lines of text that come below it. This is a richer view than a simple icon and label, but it's easier to read than report view because all the information is in one place rather than making your eye have to scan all the way across the row. We ran out of style bits. We were so lucky the original list view had 4 styles, which fits in exactly 2 bits. Well, now we have a 5th style. So we ran out of bits. So there's a new macro you use, list view set view. You pass it a view ID. In this case, you can pass in view tile. So let's see here. I have a little list view program. It just adds a bunch of items to a list view. I am here taking advantage of a new style that we added in Windows Vista, a header in all views. You see this, for example, in Explorer, so that way, even if you're not in report view, there's still a header control that can be used to select columns and adjust sorting. And I used to have some code here that rotated through the styles, and instead of reading the style from the window style, I use these new macros, get view and set view, and increment and loop through accordingly. So here it is. We have everybody's favorite icon view. And then if I remember what function key I hooked up to it, report view, small icons, list. And this is the new tile view. And so all I did here was add a call to change the view to tile mode. So as it stands, there's not much additional information here. It's the same information as large icon mode, except the text moved to the side. Ooh, very exciting. There is one cool thing going on already, which is if I change the sorting, I just sorted by type, and the sort key shows up as sort of the first line of extra bonus information. I can sort by date modified, and then the modified date shows up. So there's already a little bit going on. But obviously, that's not the real, people. If you stop there, people are like, well, so what? Let me see. Ugh. The real interesting thing, of course, with list view tiles is that you get to control what that extra bonus information is. For each item, you can decide which columns. So we had the 3 columns: name, type, modified date. You can specify which columns you wish to show as the additional information. In principle, you could have each tile show different columns. You can have, dog will show its type, but cat will show its modified time. You could do this in principle. In general, it's probably not a great idea because it's just kind of ends up kind of confusing to the user, wondering why the information is not uniformly presented. But you can see that we actually still do it. For example, here, most of these items here are in tile. Most of these items, this is tile view. Most of these items are just a normal icon and text. But here we say that, oh, some of these items here will show the first line in boldface, which you can alter with custom draw. And we have one little bonus line of text to indicate what program is going to be run. So if used judiciously, you can play a little with the non-uniform tiles. But generally speaking, you want to keep things pretty uniform. In addition, you also have to tell the list view control in general how many lines of text to reserve. The list view will then take the columns that you provided and fill them in to the extra lines of text that you reserved. And there's some other parameters for adjusting margins and things, if you're not happy with the layout, you can create a little extra room around them or something. So I'm adding these tiles. I'll specify some columns. I'd like column 1 and 2. First, column 0 is the name. That's already being displayed. Column 1 was the type. Column 2 is the modified date. And I also tell the list view control in general that I would like 2 additional lines of text. So this variable C lines is really the number of additional lines, so for a total of 3. And just to save me from having to hit F6 a lot, I'm just going to set it into tile view just right off the start. So this is what we get. We have each item here. And the two columns of information that I asked each item to display, the type and the modified date, are already showed as the extra information. But if I change the sort order, the tile view understands that, oh, well, the user is really interested in the modified date, so I'm going to put that first. Even if the modified date, like as in before, the modified date wasn't even in the list of columns to display, if you sort by it, the tile view will say, well, I guess that column's important. We'll put it in. Having these extra lines also means that, for example, if I take dog here and I rename it to dog, 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 Toto, Toto, Toto. I need to make it a little longer here. Woof. All right. If you make it really long enough that notice here that the text is actually wrapping, the tile view says, well, I've got 3 lines to play with. The name of this item doesn't fit in 1 line. I'll borrow a line. So now we have 2 lines. Looks a little better. So there's sort of dynamic choice of information presentation. You can say what columns you want, and the tile view says, well, that's good to know. But if it runs into trouble, it'll spill into the next line, or change the order of the presentation based on your sort criteria. Ugh. If you read the documentation, you'll also see some discussion about list view extended tiles, some instructions about how to get them, how to use them. It turns out list view extended tiles simply don't work. So whenever you see an MSDN discussion of list view extended tiles, you can just take out your magic marker and scritch it out on your screen. Just don't navigate anywhere else. So we're sorry, they don't work. The documentation was written before we realized that they didn't work. I'm sorry? Which is yes, exactly. Which is just when I wrote this talk was when I realized that they don't work, and I sent a nice letter to our doc people saying, we need to fix this. Windows XP added grouping. This is where you can take your tiles or take your list view items and position them inside groups with headers. To use groups, it's pretty straightforward. You create your groups. You use list view insert group to create them. You assign a group ID to each of your items, and then you turn on grouping with enable group view. So we'll turn this on in our little sample program. So here, after I've inserted my columns, I'll create some groups. I'll call the first one images. I'll call the second one videos. The group ID is really not important as long as it's unique. So in honor of Windows 7, I've decided that images will be called group 7. And in honor of PDC 2008, videos will be group 2008. So here I go, and I turn on grouping. And I run this program, and I get nothing. This is a common problem when you're playing with grouping and list view and a lot of things is you sit down, you bang out some code, you hit F5, and everything disappears. And then you have to figure out what happened. What happened was I forgot to actually tell list view which groups all of my items belong to. I said, show them in groups. And it said, I got nothing, so you get nothing. So here we go. I give each guy a group ID, and when I insert the items, I decide that, I give each of these a group ID to go into. Here's the important bit right here. When I create the item, I also set the group ID flag and set the group ID to the value from the table. Now when I run it, the items show up in groups. I can go to all these different views, large icon mode, these groups. You just get stuff in groups. Except for some reason, list mode doesn't like groups. Go figure. And just to make things interesting, I put dog and cat in the images group. All this tile view stuff still works. The sorting, they're just being grouped together differently. I put dog and cat in images because people like to take pictures of their dog and cat. I put carrot in videos because people like to take pictures of videos of carrots. You go to YouTube, type in videos of carrots. Man, there's like thousands of them. All right, so that was as far as you could go in Windows XP. That was pretty much the extent of grouping. So just to summarize the problems you're going to find with grouping, forgetting to assign items to groups, all of a sudden everything disappears. If you have to create a group before you can assign an item to it, otherwise list view is going to say, I don't have one of those. Then the result, of course, is that you run your program and your list view is empty. The sort of generic problem that you have with list view. And of course, if you know it's good for you, you don't give two groups the same ID because then, man, that's just crazy. Dogs and cats living together. In Windows Vista, we added a couple new features to list view grouping. Some of them nice, some of them ugly. We'll start with the nice ones. Actually, some of these are still ugly. You decide. You can give groups subtitles. So we saw that we had the title images. You can also stick a little text under there as a subtitle. You can also put text at the bottom of the group. It's called the footer. Groups can be collapsed out, expanded. You can put a little help link in the title header of a group. And there's a little function here for enumerating the contents of the group. And this is another one of these things you have to know. If you ask for items and limit yourself to the same group, you also have to say that you're interested in the visible order. If you don't say that, then you don't get anything. This is an unfortunate failure mode of list view, which is if you mess up, you don't get anything. So I'm trying to let you know what you need to say so you get something. So let's do some more grouping stuff. Let's take a look at some of these new guys. So for example, here, I added a footer and a state. I'm going crazy here. I added a footer. I said this guy's collapsible. I gave it a subtitle. I gave it some text. For the videos section, I'm also giving it a task. It's called search for related videos. Of course, you have to figure out what you're going to do when the user clicks on the task. And when that happens, the list view fires a new notification, LVN link click. We see it here. The link click structure has a group ID, or actually it's called sub item, but it's really group ID. Is another one of these confusing things about list view. It's called sub ID. It's really group ID. And it's the ID of the group whose link was clicked. So if somebody clicks on the link for group 2008, we're going to say, hey, I should do something. So if we run this program, we see that we have our images, and here's our subtitle, images found on your computer, and a little footer here, double-click an image to view it. There's, I can collapse these puppies. There's a little thingy here. It works in these different modes. And if I click on the search for related videos link that's in the group header, up comes the code that said, you're not done working on this yet. So that's sort of like the limit of the parts that work and don't look hideous. Then you go crazy. If you look in the documentation, it talks about group descriptions. And it also says that there's this huge checklist of about 5 things you have to do in order to get them. Your group has to have a group header. It has to have an image list. Your group needs a title image. The header must be centered. I'm surprised it doesn't say you have to, like, pat your head. If you manage to follow all the rules and actually get your group to show up, it still looks hideous. So, but you won't believe me, so I will show you. So here's my header image list. I say, OK, I'm doing what you tell me. I have my description. I give it a top and a bottom description. I center it. I give it a title image. I'm doing what you tell me. And please show me a beautiful, holy cow, this is really awful. So I mean, this is like information overload, hideous UI. Why did we even add this feature? Here's our description text. They're right on top of each other. It's really not readable. The link is still here. The image and the text are right on top of each other. If you know what's good for you, don't go down this route. It just looks awful. So this is one of these cases of something that it's documented, it works, and you still don't want it. OK, that's enough of list views. Those were the big nasty bits. Now it's the sort of smaller, quicker bits. Queue banners, of course, you've seen these on web pages for a long time. This is just a little text in an edit control or a combo box that says, search or to give the user a clue as to what we expect them to type into this control. Queue banners follow the push model. You tell the control what you would like to display as your queue banner. We have new messages, em set queue banner and cb set queue banner. They take a string parameter, you call it, and if the control is empty, then the string shows up. If you want to change it, you just call set queue banner again, new text. If there's something in the edit control, then that's what shows up and not your queue banner. List views have a similar concept, although it's not called a queue banner because users don't type into list view. It's more just some feedback to the users. The user calls up some UI. There's an empty window, and some of them will just sort of sit there. It's like, well, still working, waiting for the answer. So you can put up some text to let the user know. It's like, OK, no, I'm actually ready. You can do stuff now, as opposed to it's empty. It's taking its time. You know how computers are. So for example, here, just this little simple sample, I decided to say, oh, here's some instructions. You can drop files here to create your slideshow. This is a notification. The list view uses pull model rather than push model. you don't sort of on your own tell ListView what you want to display as your empty text. Rather, you just sit and wait, and if ListView decides that, oh, perhaps I should display something here, it then says, hey, I want to display some text because there are no items. Then you can respond to lvn get empty markup, provide the text that you want to display. And the word markup here tells you that there's actually an active link going on in here. And we'll see that in the sample. You can actually put a link into this text. So for example, here it says, click here to see a demonstration. We'll see how we can get that link to show up. Let's see. So I have a simple app. And here I have a combo box and an edit control. I will put the word author as the Q banner for the edit control, and the word and the word title as the Q banner for the combo box. That's the easy way. ListView, of course, just to be different, does it a different way. So instead, ListView will, when it's time to display, when ListView realizes that the list is empty and it's still drawing, it says, hey, what should I display as the empty text? And then we respond and say, hey, drop files here to add to your slideshow. And we use the bracket /A to indicate where the link is. When the user clicks on the link, we get another copy of this lvn link click notification. And the way to tell that this link click came not from a group, but rather from your empty text, is that the sub-item, I sub-item, is -1. So here we go. If I click here, this is an edit control. If I click in, the word author disappears. I can type an author. It's a French author. If I delete the text, then the Q shows back up. This is a combo box, but it's the same idea. If you delete it, then the Q comes back. And if I drop stuff in, and oh, now the list view is no longer empty, so the Q text it's not Q text. It is the empty text. The empty text disappears. However, now I can't illustrate because I didn't bother implementing delete. So instead, I will launch this program again. So the click here to see a demonstration. If I click it, then hopefully I should have shown you a demonstration. Instead, I put up a message box. So those are 2 items off of the list. Alpha blended menu bitmaps are new to Windows Vista. However, menu bitmaps have been around for a long time. In fact, they were added in Windows 2000. But this still hasn't stopped people from ignoring this and using owner draw menus anyway. Office started this trend by having little pictures next to each of your menu items. And this is not something that the Windows menu system provided on its own. So everybody said, well, I will just owner draw my menus. So the menu comes in. But when you owner draw a menu, you have to draw everything. You not only have to draw the cute little picture that you wanted, you also have to render the text. You have to worry about the default, whether it's bold for default. You have to pick the right font. You have to get the margins right. It's a lot of work that people do just to get a cute little picture next to the menu. But it turns out this feature is already there. And in Windows Vista, it became even nicer because now the bitmap that you provide can be alpha blended. So you do this by setting the bitmap as the HBM item when you insert the menu into your, when you insert the item into your menu. You set the MIM bitmap flag so it knows that there's a bitmap there. In order to get the alpha blended bitmap, your bitmap needs to be a 32-bit per pixel pre-multiplied ARGB. And it has to have been created by create dib section or one of its moral equivalents like LR create dib section or something like that. When you add a bitmap to a menu item, the window manager does not take ownership of the bitmap. You are still responsible for deleting it when you no longer need it. So let's take a little look at these menu bitmaps. So here is a little program that I wrote that just displays a one-item context menu when I click on it. And right now, there is no bitmap. And it highlights and acts like a boring program. Let me turn on the magnifier. If I then, OK, I probably didn't want to magnify that. All right. So this is my program on the context menu. I turn on the bitmap flag. Sorry, I didn't highlight this in yellow. I turn on the MIM bitmap flag. This says that there is a bitmap in this menu item as well. And instead of instead of loading it out of a resource, which is what you would normally do because you want to have actual designers and people who with degrees in graphics arts designing these bitmaps rather than you pounding away code. But of course, I am not a graphics designer and I was lazy, and also this makes it a self-contained sample. So I actually build a 32 bit per pixel pre-multiplied ARGB bitmap on the fly. I'm so strong. So here it is, but the key step here is that we set the bit count to 32. We say it's an RGB bitmap. This creates a 32 bit per pixel bitmap. We created with not create bitmap, but with create dib section. So the dib section plus 32 bit per pixel is the key to indicating that we have an alpha blended bitmap. And then I decide that I'm so cute, I'm going to use a pink gradient. After we display the context menu with track pop-up menu, we can then we're no longer in need of the bitmap. We need to delete it, otherwise it's going to leak. OK, now I can run the magnifier. Yay. So now, when I right-click, we have a nice little alpha-blended pink gradient. And it really is alpha-blended because you see that the transparent part here, it fades out to blue. And when I move off it, it fades out to gray. So we really are getting nice pictures, alpha-blended, so you don't have to do all this crazy owner draw menu stuff. Especially since when you're doing the owner draw menu work, not only do you have to remember to get the right font and to position the text right, and even like draw this little etching thing, you then have to implement all the accessibility stuff so that way screen readers can read the word bingo out of the menu item. And so that way, screen readers work, accessibility tools work. You can sell to the US government, little things like that. Not that the US government has a lot of money to buy things nowadays. OK. Oh, and that was the demo. Icon scaling is another thing that we added. This is Windows Vista introduced super mondo huge 256 by 256 bitmaps. The scaling algorithm for these bitmaps changed in Windows Vista because the visuals people realized that the algorithm that Windows XP and previous versions of Windows used sort of resulted in some unpleasant results when deciding which image to use and stretch or shrink to produce the final image. The old algorithm would study the images in the icon and choose the one whose dimensions were closest to the target dimensions. If it was larger, it would shrink it down. If it's smaller, it's going to stretch it up. The problem with stretching up is that when you take a bitmap and you stretch it up, you have to manufacture pixels for the ones that got newly created. And so you essentially have to create information from a smaller starting point. Whereas if you're shrinking down, you have a lot of information, and when you shrink it down, you then selectively throw away information, and you can it's much easier to generate a nice image when you have a higher resolution than if you have a smaller resolution. The trick about this is that in order to use this new function, load icon with scale down, your icon file has to include images at sizes 16, 32, 48, and 256. These are special numbers that the load icon with scale down function looks for and tries to hit. So for example, if we ask for an image at 96, an icon that's 96 by 96, but the only images in the icon are 16, 32, 48, 256, the old algorithm would say, well, 48 is closest to 96, so I will take the 48 by 48 image and stretch it up to 96. Whereas the new algorithm, load icon with scale down, will say, I will go to the 256 and shrink it down to 96. The old load image, load icon functions still use the old algorithm because they're still part of user32, and user32 is pretty conservative when it comes to these sorts of changes. If you want to use the new scaling algorithm, you need to call this new function load icon with scale down. Or if you are worried about working on both systems, both Windows Vista and down level, you can use shdef extract icon, which also uses the new scaling algorithm. But on older systems, it still uses the old algorithm. So in a sense, shdef extract icon is sort of the catch-all. It sort of covers both bases. I have a picture here. On the left, we have an image generated from an icon that has the necessary images using the old algorithm. You see that, for example, and on the right-hand side is an image generated with the new algorithm. You see on the left-hand side that the diagonal line at the bottom of the drawer is a little jaggier. The Windows flag logo is pretty much indistinct, and the floppy disk is kind of chunky. Whereas on the right-hand side, it looks a little bit nicer. Just for fun, I will show you. So here's a program. So here's a program that takes one of my little icons, displays it at 96 using both the old and the new algorithms. So icon 0, I'm going to use load image. So that's old algorithm. Icon 1, I'm going to use load icon with scale down, new algorithm. Icon 2, shdef extract icon, sort of flip-floppy. We'll use the new algorithm if available. We'll use the old algorithm if not. And of course, I don't want to leak stuff, so I need to destroy those icons. You can see if I can magnify this, and we can see this is the same picture that I had in the slide, but now it's for real, so you know that it wasn't just a cut and paste cheat. It's really happening that for example, you can see, I don't know if we want to zoom this in some more, but for example, the little Windows logo on the green thing in the front is pretty much a blob on the left-hand side, whereas on the right-hand side, it actually still retains some of its Windows logo-y shape. And you can also see the blurriness on the floppy drive. Actually, we'll do questions at the end. Let's see. Ooh, that's pretty cool. That was not the load icon with scale down function. That's just a special new feature of this projector system. I wrote it. Oh, it's stuck. Well, that's great. I'll just talk, and you can't see the text on my next slide unless you were really, really quick and saw it when I flipped to it by mistake. The last topic is about foreground activation and love. Foreground activation is one of these problems that a lot of programs have, especially if you're trying to simulate a single instance program, or you want to be a single instance program. The user runs a new copy of your program, and you want to sort of take all the information that the user passed to the second copy and hand it to the first copy so it can open it in MDI, or just otherwise just be a single instance program. There are techniques for managing this. People are familiar with it, and I won't go into that. The issue here is that a common problem that we run into is that people run your program. They then run your program again. The second copy takes all its parameters, sends them to the first program. The first program then tries to display the contents of the document that the second program tried to write, or something like that. We are going to try to fix this. The second program packages up all the parameters, gives them to the first program. The first program then says, great, I have now opened this document. And it just blinks in the taskbar, and the user then has to click on it to actually see the document that they thought they had just double-clicked on and opened. The reason for this is that there are the rules for foreground activation. Foreground activation is like love because it can be shared with you, but you can't steal it. This is a really bad analogy, but I'm stretching. Work with me here. The idea is that program 1 is running. Users, but is not operating in program 1, some other program. Goes to explore, double-clicks another document. Program 2 starts. Program 2, since it is just starting up, triggered by a double-click, so triggered by an end-user action, has permission to take foreground. The first program, however, is just sitting there, minding its own business, and the window manager says, the user is not dealing with that program. That program is just parked in the background. When your program then takes its parameters, packages them up, sends them to the, for example, oh, well, we send a private message to the first program, and then it unpacks the parameters and then displays the document. The first program then calls set foreground window in order to get that new document up on the screen so the user can interact with it, but instead it just gets the blinky. And that's because as far as the window manager is concerned, what happened? You have some program that the user is not interacting with. The user interacts with Explorer, launches a second program. Second program has permission to interact with the user. It then sends a message to some program, sends a message over here, and then exits. Now, this program suddenly decides that, hey, I want to interact with the user. And the window manager says, I wasn't talking to you. The user was talking to Explorer and was talking to this other program, but he wasn't talking to you, so go away. The solution for this is to share foreground window, the ability to set the foreground window. The simplest way, of course, is not to worry about sharing, but simply to have the second program, when it fires up, packages up all the parameters, sends them to the first program. The second program is allowed to interact with the user. So it is the second program that can call set foreground window. So you can take all the parameters that were passed to your second program, send them off to the first program. First program responds saying, OK, I'm ready. Here's the window. And the second program says, great, set foreground window on that window that the original program created. Since the second program has permission to interact with the user, it has permission to give foreground to another window, even if that window doesn't belong to the second program. That's the simplest way. That's the way we like to do things because the permission to set the foreground window doesn't have to. There's not very complicated accounting going on. Second program runs. It is allowed to change the foreground window. It changes the foreground window. Everybody's happy. In practice, the architecture of your program may not permit this type of communication back and forth. So an alternative is for the second program, when it sends the message to the first program, or just before it sends the message, to call the function allow set foreground window. This tells the window manager, that program over there is also allowed to interact with the user. Of course, in order to do this, the calling program must have permission to interact with the user. So the second program that runs, it has permission to interact with the user. It calls allow set foreground window, passing the process ID of the first program. It can certainly get that because it has a window from that program. When the first program finally takes the parameters, decides what to do, creates the window, calls set foreground window, the window manager says, I remember you. This other guy told me about you. I'm ready. And so this guy is now allowed to change the foreground window because the second program that you ran shared its permission to interact with the user with the first program. In the case where you are activating an object through a comm server, you don't actually know the window handle of the other program or its process ID. The comm folks have added a function called co-allow set foreground window. You pass it a pointer to some server proxy type object. It will then consult its own private little bookkeeping and turn that into a call to allow set foreground window on whatever server is actually displaying the content. So that's sort of the basic idea about foreground activation. The window that the user is interacting with is allowed to change the foreground window. If that program decides to share that permission with another program, that's permitted. But the second program is not allowed to, or the other programs are not allowed to steal activation from the first program. So that's sort of where I got the really bad foreground activation is like love analogy. But the basic idea is just that you can give away what you have. If you don't have foreground activation permission, you certainly can't. If you call allow set foreground window and say, it's OK for that guy to interact with the user, the window manager is going to say, well, but who are you? Anyway, so basic idea. Plan A, have the second program call set foreground window itself. Plan B, have it call allow set foreground window on the first program, so the first program can call set foreground window when it's ready. Plan C, use co-allow set foreground window, and then comm will turn around and consult its little tables and call allow set foreground window on the final destination. That's sort of the end of the officially slidey part. I'm supposed to tell you about, please fill out, you can't tell, please fill out your evaluation for this session at microsoftpdc.com. And this session will be available as a recording at, and then it's blank. So sometime. I guess we can take some questions. There's a microphone up here in the center. Everybody's clapping. Hey, we have a question.
I may have missed something somewhere, so everybody can throw things at me if this has already been covered somewhere else. But the new ribbon control, is that going to be part of comctl32?
The new ribbon control is going to be provided by a different library. But I mean, I don't even know if we know what the name of the new library is going to be yet. We're still trying to decide. But the ribbon control in Windows 7 will be provided, but it will not come from comctl. It will come from some other library. The precise details of obtaining access to this new library, I'm sure, is covered in a hands-on lab somewhere out in the hands-on lab area. Anything else?
You're talking about activation before. Is there anything planned to sort out when you've got an input field with focus, not losing focus when another application starts?
Yes, there's a function that I forget when it was added. It may be Windows XP. It's definitely in Windows Vista, called lock set foreground window. So if you are a program that's interacting with the user, and this is typically in the case where, for example, you're displaying something that's trying to simulate a context menu, or some other UI where if another application took focus, it would like destroy all the work that the user had spent 5 minutes playing mousey maze trying to get to. You can call lock set foreground window, and this says, don't let another program steal foreground window from me because I'm busy in this sort of mousey maze kind of complicated user interaction scenario. You can then, and I believe it takes a Boolean, so you say you lock with true, and then once that state is complete, you can lock with false. And while foreground activation is locked, then other programs will not be able to, even if they normally would be allowed to, they can't call set foreground window.
Is it possible that you could bake that in to the password input box, such that a password box can never lose focus? Because one of the biggest things I found is typing in a password, focus shifts to Notepad or whatever, it's just fired up, and a password comes out in plain text.
Right.
Can that be baked into the control?
That's something we can add to the wish list. But right. Thanks for bringing it up.
Okay, thanks.
Is it possible at all to have a application have its own XP theme or own themed kind of look for the common controls, things like that, using the theme support? That's private from like the rest of the OS.
Right. So by a private theme, you mean
one that would
like, for example, every other app in the window in the system is using Arrow, except I want this one to use Classic.
Right.
I'm not really the expert on that, but I'm not convinced that there is a way. Part of the idea for that is so that way the idea behind the theme is to, of course, create a uniform experience. And so if you let people make exceptions, then all of a sudden it starts looking like a patchwork, and it sort of it destroys the room doesn't come together. It's one of those artistic kind of things. So you can stop by at the Ask the Experts afterwards, and we can discuss it further and see what we can come up with.
Okay, thanks.
Are the controls going to be rewritten using the new Direct2D and Direct Write APIs, or is this still going to use the old GDI, GDI Plus stuff?
The controls are still going to stick to GDI and GDI Plus. The problem with the common controls in user32 is that by this point, they're so old. I mean, the controls in user32 can vote, they can drive, and they can drink alcohol. I mean, at this point, they've got teenage kids that are bugging them, and so making changes at that fundamental level creates a very large risk to compatibility. There are so many crazy things I've seen applications do. That's like, oh, here's an edit control. It belongs to another program, but that's okay. I'm going to inject myself in and send him some crazy messages and like get the text handle buffer and start changing control characters around. So anytime you try to mess with, you tinker with the innards, there's always the risk that some crazy application somewhere is going to keel over. So these types of changes are always taken with a great deal of trepidation, and application compatibility is a very high priority for Windows 7. So tearing it apart and rewriting it is really too high a risk for at least for the Windows 7 timeframe.
Are all these changes are available in MFC? The item info and like different bitmaps.
I'm sorry, I guess I didn't understand the question.
You know, like you were showing there are new messages.
Right.
Are they available for MFC too?
I mean, you can certainly call send message from MFC. You can use the macros from MFC. I don't know if MFC has been updated to add specific, custom methods for each of these new messages. But if not, you can certainly just, do things the old-fashioned way. One more.
It's not a question.
This is my boss, by the way.
I just want to add a piece of information to what Raymond was saying. There was some question about the ribbon. Actually, there's a presentation at 4:45 in room 151, right, like in 45 minutes for people who are interested into it.
That's right. Ribbon talk comes right after this one, although not in this room. And what's the title? What's the title of this?
New shell user interfaces or something.
New
like
shell
that.
user interface. A nice vague title because we didn't want to give away anything in your printed materials.
And for MFC, by the way, there's also a talk tomorrow about MFC. So I will encourage you to go there.
All right. Well, I guess that's it. Let's go get ice cream.